I want to say a few things about Derry, Pennsylvania. How it happened, things that happened there. And to be able to tell you about Derry, I'm probably going to have to say things about what was around Derry, the area there. Because Derry wasn't the first thing there. You might think about the place called New Derry. People think New Derry was happened after Derry. Not so. New Derry is actually Old Derry, and Derry is the New Derry. Confusing? No kidding. The name comes from Derry Township, which was one of the old townships in the county. Not the first, not one of the first. The first townships were the ones that were created when the county was created in 1773. But Derry Township was the first township that happened after that creation. Derry Township came about in 1775. And very early on, a town, more or less, came about in Derry Township, which became known as Derry Town. But that was not the Derry we know. There were some of the original settlers in the county showed up right around there. And there was a fort just north of New Derry called Fort Barr, which tells us there were Indians at the time when the first settlers came, because they needed a place where they had to go for refuge when the Indians would cause trouble. Now, the town of New Derry, just to give you some sense of when or how long it's been there, in the year 1815, some of the Guthrie family laid out the town that became what we know today as New Derry. It's been there for quite a while. Actually, there was habitation around there since the 1760s or so. Now, Derry, what we know as Derry, never came about until a railroad showed up. Not just any railroad, it was the first railroad in the area, the main line of the new Pennsylvania Railroad that was being put through in the 1850s. And it wasn't till the early 1850s, 1850, 1852, that the town we now know as Derry had its beginnings. And actually, because of that railroad, the town of Derry was once a very important place on the railroad, which is not anymore, but it was. The town of Derry was chosen by the Pennsylvania Railroad to be its classification yard and repair yard for all the freight. All the trains that ran between Altoona and Pittsburgh, all the freight trains, were under the control of Derry, because that was the yard where the trains were made up, all the manifests were put together, the trains were assembled there and sent out, east or west. A big issue with that, putting trains together and repairing them, was Derry sat at a place where it was before the ridge of the Alleghenies. The Alleghenies were a big deal getting a train across there, over between Altoona and Johnstown. The ridge of the Alleghenies was hard to get over. You had to have trains in good condition. You had to get enough motive power, that is enough engines on there to pull them over. And you had to have their bearings working right, their couplings working right, the brakes working right. They took care of that at Derry. Now, after a certain time, the main office, the division head, was moved to Pittsburgh. And after that point, things at Derry somewhat eclipsed, because the big railroad activity was happening at Pittsburgh because the Pennsylvania Railroad was building their railroad west out through Ohio and Indiana and so on. And at first, the major industry in Derry was the railroad. But after that, after it somewhat subsided in importance as an industry, other things took over. The first big thing was mining. Matthias Saxman started to build important mining operations. The Saxmans were some of the first settlers. Saxman's ancestor, Christopher Saxman, had settled just by Latrobe, in the very early times. Also, in the early 1900s, we see refractory industries moving into Derry. Things where pottery was made, things where bricks were made. And then about 1908, a company from Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh High Voltage Insulator Company bought out those refractory businesses and started to make electrical insulators, which industry was bought out about 10 years later by Westinghouse, run as a subsidiary. And then in 1927, Westinghouse set it up as one of their major operations, making insulators. A lot of people remember that. I think we've said enough now, and what we're going to do is shut this video down and then switch to pictures. We get a chance now to look at a few pictures. These might help explain things, make things a bit more clear. I talked about Derry Township. This is Derry Township. Over here, this is New Alexandria. Over here is Latrobe. This up here is called Derry Station. Back when this map was made in 1867, what we know as Derry was known as Derry Station. Over here is New Derry. Derry only exists because the main line was built. This is the main line of the railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad. This is the water gap through the Chestnut Ridge, coming down along the west bank of the ridge. The main line comes down this way and goes over to Latrobe and out to Greensburg. This is Google Earth looking down. Contemporary view. This is Derry right here. This is the water gap where the Conemaugh makes its way through Chestnut Ridge. This is Chestnut Ridge. And down here we have Derry and New Derry over here. Latrobe being over here. Now, this is Derry Station, what we know today as Derry. This mapping comes from 1867. What you can see here is that the Pennsylvania Railroad was working on a classification yard. It wasn't just a classification yard, it was a repair yard, which a lot of classification yards were. Like down in Youngwood, that was also a repair yard and classification yard once upon a time. The other thing you can see here is that Derry in 1867 was not very populated. Not much was happening. I mean, there weren't a lot of people there. Most people belonged to the railroad. These guys were railroad employees, but these were only the guys at the top of the feeding chain. Most of the guys who were doing the work were not even showing up on the business directory. You notice a lot of hotels. A lot of hotels. Well, some of the guys, maybe a lot of them working for the railroad, were living in hotels because there weren't a lot of There wasn't a lot of housing in Derry yet. One of the curiosities or interesting things to me is that as early as 1867, there was a photographer. W.J. Blair was a photographer out there in Derry, and he was also a dealer in groceries and notion. He was running a store, and he had a photography outfit set up, which is surprising to me because Greensburg at that point didn't even have a photographer yet. Now, this shows us 1867, just showing relationships. This is the big issue. This is the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad coming down through. Even though the PRR was an east-west railroad, there was a place where it was not going exactly east and west. It came from the east coming this way and then went west down here. Also showing us various points we should be aware of. This is Derry Station, which we now know as Derry. It wasn't a very big place then. This is New Derry, which was in 1867 a bigger place than Derry. This shows us the layout of New Derry and will also further help to convince us that it was a much more developed place than what we now know as Derry, because it had about 3 churches. There were businesses going on, a lot of people living there. You can take a look and just figure out for yourself that it was a well-developed place by the time that what we now know as Derry was just getting started. Again, I like these context shots. This is the top of Chestnut Ridge, which was pretty much the eastern boundary of Derry Township. Down here you have Derry. This is Derry Station, called then. It was called Derry Station because the only place out there that had a name was Derry. And when the railroad came through, this was called Derry Station, which meant the station for Derry. And you show it circling around, coming through Bradenville, down through Latrobe. Bradenville was then called St. Clair City. Just a bit north of Derry, you see places like Millwood, Hillside. In our next little production on Derry, Derry number 2, we're going to see things that happened up around Hillside when the railroad was being built. And I think that's enough for our beginning of the story of Derry, Pennsylvania. Slick and Shiny Productions has once more come to an end of our admittedly not very slick and shiny productions as we stumble our way through a maze of digital nonsense and hopefully get a story together. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again when we put together Derry number 2.